Meanwhile, the chief carried on with his duties, walking the streets with calm eyes, inspecting outposts, speaking with workers, settling disputes with a few quiet words that carried more weight than long arguments ever could. Yet, even as he lived the role of protector, his instincts never rested. He saw the way some eyes followed him, not with respect but with shadow. He knew resentment was growing, and he knew too well that resentment rarely stayed hidden for long. At night he sat in the backyard with his family, the lanterns glowing softly, his children leaning against him, their questions sharper now, their voices filled with curiosity. About Earth, about the battles whispered in taverns, about the truth of what kind of man their father had once been. He answered little, only enough to calm them, but he knew silence could not shield them forever. The colony itself was already telling stories, and children hear stories even when parents do not speak them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the alien hills and the stars bled into the sky, the sound of quiet steps reached the chief before. They touched the edge of the yard, his ears sharper than most, his instincts honed by years of survival. He rose before the figure even appeared, his eyes narrowing as the alien neighbor stepped out of the shadows, his hands empty, his face pale but tight with forced courage. Neighbors watched from windows again, sensing something was about to unfold. The neighbor called out, his voice quivering but loud enough for others to hear. He accused the chief of ruling through fear, of bending the colony's peace into silence, of being more warlord than protector. The crowd stirred, whispers rising. For this was bold, too bold. Yet behind his trembling voice, the chief heard something more dangerous than courage. He heard desperation, the kind that drives a weak heart to reckless acts. The chief stepped closer, his boots echoing against the stone, and his silence stretched, long, pressing against the neighbor until sweat glistened along his brow. Then at last he spoke, not with anger, but with a calmness colder than any threat. He said the neighbor had mistaken fear for respect, mistaken silence for weakness, and mistaken unity for control. He said the colony would not be divided by petty hearts, and if anyone believed otherwise, they would face not his badge but the truth of what humans were. The words spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass, and the alien neighbor faltered, his voice breaking as he tried to answer, but nothing came. His throat dry, his courage shattered by the weight of a Deathworlder's presence. The chief turned away, his family watching with steady eyes, his neighbors with wide ones, and as he stepped back into his yard, the truth settled over the colony once again, heavier than before, that humans did not need to shout to be obeyed. Their very silence carried storms, and storms, once awakened, never forget their path. The colony night stretched long and still, but beneath its quiet lay a truth no one could ignore. The family's backyard was once again lit by the soft glow of lanterns. The children huddled near their mother, whispering in low voices as they watched their father stand at the edge of the yard, his silhouette outlined against the stars, his badge catching faint glimmers of light. Neighbors peeked from their windows, their faces pressed to the glass, some with awe, some with unease, and some with fear, for word of the confrontation had spread quickly. The alien neighbor's reckless challenge had become the colony's latest tale, and though he had walked away alive, everyone knew his pride had died before the entire street. Still, anger burns even when pride is broken, and in the days that followed, the alien neighbor's house stayed dark, but whispers of his plotting seeped into the corners of taverns and shops, his bitterness infecting those who already resented the presence of a human carrying the badge. The chief knew it. He felt it in the way certain eyes followed him on his patrols. In the way conversations stopped when he entered a room, he carried himself the same, calm, unshaken. But inside he weighed every step, for he knew enemies grow quiet before they grow bold. He had lived long enough to recognize the shape of unrest. Yet his family needed normalcy, his children needed laughter. So each night he returned to the backyard, lighting the lanterns, serving the food, letting his children play beneath the alien stars. Though the music no longer filled the night, their voices were enough to hold back the shadows. His wife stood, close to him, her eyes searching his face. Seeing the weight he carried even when he spoke little, she knew his silence well. It was the silence of a man preparing for storms. Then came the night when the storm nearly broke. Footsteps again echoed. In the street heavier, more than one. And the chief lifted his head instantly, his instincts sharper than any sensor. His children froze. The lantern flames flickered as three figures emerged from the darkness. Not patrol officers this time, but colonists, their faces set with unease and anger. Behind them, barely visible, the alien neighbor lingered in the shadows, his eyes wide and hungry for revenge. The three stepped forward, demanding to know why one man should hold so much power, why a death worlder should rule over voices not his own. Their words were sharp, meant to cut, but their voices trembled, betraying the fear that lived in their hearts. The neighbors in their homes leaned closer to their windows, holding their breath, for this was no longer just a complaint. It was a confrontation. The line had been crossed. The chief did not shout. He did not move quickly. He stepped forward with calm precision, every footfall steady, his eyes locking. Onto the three men, he told them in a voice that carried like steel through the air that power was not given to him by fear. It was given by duty. He reminded them of the oath he had sworn, not to Earth, not to war, but to the colony itself, to protect every voice, even theirs, even the ones that hated him. His words rippled through the silence, heavy and sharp, and the crowd at their windows felt it too. The men wavered, their courage shrinking under his steady gaze. The alien neighbor hissed from the shadows, urging them on. But they could not. For in that moment, the chief's silence pressed harder than any weapon, and they stepped back, one after another, until only the neighbor remained half-hidden, his face pale, his breath shallow, his plotting shattered once more. The chief turned his eyes on him then, and the neighbor felt as though the weight of an entire death world pressed upon his chest. His knees nearly buckled. He opened his mouth to speak, to curse, to accuse, but no words came. The chief did not need to say more. The silence itself was enough. A silence filled with storms of battles fought across galaxies, of fleets burned to ash, of enemies who had once thought as this neighbor did, only to learn too late what it meant to provoke a death worlder. The neighbor stumbled back into the dark, slamming his door, and the street remained still, every onlooker knowing the matter was ended, at least for now. The chief returned to his family, his wife's hand slipping into his children crowding around him, and for the first time in many nights he allowed himself a faint smile, not of triumph, but of resolve. He knew the unrest would never vanish completely. He knew jealousy would always whisper in the dark, but he also knew the colony had seen the truth with their own eyes, that humans did not rule by shouting. They ruled by standing, by surviving, by enduring, and that was more powerful than fear. The lanterns flickered gently, laughter returned in cautious bursts, and the colony, though restless, began to understand what it meant to live under the watch of a death worlder, calm until provoked, unstoppable when challenged, and the story of that backyard, of that badge, of that silence, became a legend whispered under alien skies, a legend that would never fade. That evening, as the family gathered for another meal under the stars, footsteps echoed faintly along the street. The father lifted his head instantly, instincts sharper than any sensor. The lantern light caught the figure of a patrol officer. Approaching, his posture stiff, his visor reflecting the glow, neighbors peeked from their windows again, curious and afraid. The alien neighbor's curtains shifted too, his eyes watching, hungry to see the chief humbled. The officer saluted before speaking, his voice clear, saying that the council had received word of unrest, that questions had been raised about the human chief's handling of the disturbance, and that he was being asked to explain his actions. Before a panel, the crowd's whispers grew louder, some shocked, some amused. The alien neighbor's heart lifted with bitter joy, thinking at last the chief would face challenge. But the father did not flinch. He rose slowly from his chair, his children watching with wide eyes, his wife's hand tightening on his arm. For only a moment before letting go, he placed the badge back on his chest, its glint sharper than the lantern flame, and told the officer calmly that he would answer before any council, in any chamber, at any time, his words simple. But the way he spoke them made even the officer straighten taller, as if reminded who truly carried command. The alien neighbor leaned closer to his window, desperate to hear more, but what he saw instead made his blood turn cold. The patrol officer hesitated, then lowered his head, his voice softer now, confessing that the council had not summoned him by will, but by fear. That whispers of death-world cruelty had reached their ears, and they wanted to see if the stories were true. The father gave no denial, he only turned his eyes toward the stars, the silence stretching long before he finally said that fear often lives in the hearts of those who do not understand, and if the council wanted truth, he would give it to them. The family stood in quiet awe as he walked past the officer, his boots striking the ground in steady rhythm, each step echoing louder than the music had ever done. The neighbors shrank back from their windows. The alien neighbor's smug smile faded again, because once more he saw what he had tried to forget, that this was not a man who needed noise or violence. This was a death-worlder, calm as stone until tested, unshakable as the ground beneath them. And in that moment the colony understood a deeper truth. The chief did not wear the badge for power. The badge wore him because authority was already in his blood, carved into his past, carried in every breath, and the council, no matter how high or proud, would soon learn the same lesson the alien neighbor had learned too late. The council chamber was vast and cold, built from stone and metal that seemed designed to swallow voices rather than carry them. Torches of artificial light lined the walls, their glow reflecting across banners of different species, symbols of unity that now felt thin against the heavy silence filling the room. Word of the chief's summons had spread quickly, drawing representatives and curious citizens alike. Every seat was filled, every whisper sharp with expectation. Some hoped to see a human humbled, others feared what might happen if he was pressed too far, and a few simply came to witness history because humans were always stories worth telling. The father walked into the chamber with steady steps, his badge catching every flicker of light. His uniform plain but heavy with meaning. His family was not with him this time, but their faces lingered in his mind like anchors. He carried them, with him as surely as he carried the scars beneath his armor. The counselors, a mix of alien elders with scaled skin, feathered crests, and cold eyes, shifted uneasily when he approached. They had called him here, yet already they seemed aware that they had summoned something greater than themselves. The lead counselor, tall and thin with silver ridges along his jaw, raised his voice, asking why the chief had shamed a neighbor in public, why patrol forces had bowed instead of acting, why fear now filled the colony instead of trust. His tone was sharp, but his eyes betrayed caution. The father did not rush to reply. He stood in silence for a long breath, letting the weight of the room lean toward him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but it carried to every corner. He said the patrol had bowed not to a man, but to the law itself, and the law does not bend to jealousy. He said unity was not silence, it was strength, and any who tried to turn community into division were enemies of peace. His words struck the chamber like thunder, rolling slow and heavy. Some nodded, some frowned, but no one dared to interrupt. The alien neighbor, seated near the back as a witness, shifted uncomfortably, his scales prickling as he remembered the chief's eyes from that night he had come hoping to see. The man broken, but already he knew he had miscalculated again. The council pressed harder, one elder with bright feathers leaning forward, asking if the stories of Earth were true. If humans were truly death-worlders who had risen from a planet where even the air tried to kill them, asking if the badge on his chest was nothing compared to the legacy written in his blood. The father met their gaze without hesitation. He told them yes, Earth was a death world. Yes, humans were forged in the fire of endless struggle. Yes, he had commanded fleets that turned battles into silence, but he reminded them that he had left war behind to build peace here. He said the badge did not give him power. It gave him duty, and his duty was to protect not only his family, but every voice in the colony, even the ones that hated him. His honesty hung heavy in the air, and for a moment the chamber was silent. No gavel struck, no protest rose, because every being in that room felt the truth. They felt the presence of someone who had survived what they could not imagine, someone who carried scars deeper than the stone beneath their feet, and though he stood calm, they knew a storm lived just behind his eyes. The alien neighbor, finally, rose, his voice trembling as he accused the chief of intimidation, of using fear instead of justice, of silencing others through presence alone. But his words rang hollow. His courage faltered with every glance from the human's steady gaze, and the crowd's murmurs swallowed him before he could finish. The chief did not need to answer because the silence that followed already judged the neighbor harsher than any law. The council ended the session with no punishment, no removal, instead declaring the chief's authority confirmed, his position unshaken, and the chamber emptied slowly, the crowd leaving with eyes wide, each of them carrying the story in their hearts, a story they would retell until it became legend. Outside, the chief stepped back into the night. The stars spread wide above him, and though his face remained calm, his heart carried the weight of what was to come, because authority was never free. Fear never vanished, and the line between peace and war was as thin as the silence he now walked upon, and deep in the shadows of the colony, the alien neighbor swore he would not rest. His humiliation had been carved too deep, and though he feared the Death Worlder, hate has a way of surviving even where fear thrives. The days after the council, hearing were heavy with silence, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of unease, like a storm that gathers unseen beyond the horizon. The colony returned to its routines. Markets opened. Workers filed into the mines and factories. Children returned to their lessons. Yet underneath every action lay a new rhythm, a new caution. Because now every alien and every human knew the chief was more than just a man with a badge. He was a death worlder with a past carved in war. His authority confirmed not only by council decree, but by the fear and respect etched into the hearts of all who had witnessed him stand in that chamber. Some took comfort in it, believing the colony safer under his watch. Others muttered in secret, afraid that safety bought with fear was no safety at all. And in the shadows of his shuttered home, the alien neighbor muttered most of all, his pride wounded beyond repair, his shame twisting into a darker obsession. He replayed the night of the backyard, the glow of the badge, the salute of the patrol, the steady voice that silenced him without raising in volume. Each memory cut deeper, reminding him that he had been humiliated not just before his neighbors, but before the entire colony. He could not forgive it, and though his fear choked him, in the quiet hours anger burned hotter, whispering in his ear, telling him that the human had stolen his dignity, and that it must be taken back. He began to whisper to others, those who also grumbled in private, those who did not like the idea of humans commanding their law. He told them that humans were dangerous, that they could not be trusted, that one day their death-world ways would bring ruin to the colony, and though many turned away, not wanting to cross the chief, a few listened, their jealousy matching his own. The seeds of division found soil. The night deepened, and though the music had stopped, the air still carried the echo of what had just unfolded. Neighbors who had peeked from their windows now gathered in hushed clusters along the street, their whispers low and urgent. Every pair of eyes darting back to the backyard where the family stood. The alien neighbor who had started it all had vanished inside his home. Yet his presence lingered like a stain of fear. The father remained calm, his badge still glinting under the lantern light, but his silence spoke more than commands. He had not shouted. He had not threatened. Yet the entire colony now understood the weight behind his presence. His children clung to him, their trust unshaken, and his wife stood tall beside him, her hand brushing his arm in quiet support. The patrol ships were gone, but the sound of their departure had left a trail of unease, as if the engines carried whispers into the night sky, telling distant stars of what had been revealed here. The neighbors closest to the scene could not hold their curiosity. One of them, an older alien with pale skin and deep ridges on his brow, stepped closer, bowing slightly out of respect before asking in a careful voice if the celebration was truly over. His tone suggested more than curiosity. It carried fear. The father looked at him for a moment, then at the rest of the crowd, and finally he spoke. Again, his voice low but steady, telling them that the party was not a crime, that family joy was not forbidden, that the colony was meant to be a place where peace could thrive. His words spread quickly through the crowd, filling ears and settling nerves. Yet beneath the comfort lay something sharper, because everyone present remembered the rumors. They remembered the old stories of the man now standing before them. Some whispered that he had once commanded a fleet so fierce that whole enemy worlds had burned. Others said he had faced alien warlords and returned untouched, a death worlder with the kind of endurance that only Earth could shape. No one knew which stories were true, but seeing him here, calm and unshaken, made them believe, all of them. The alien neighbor inside his home pressed his back to the door, his scales cold, replaying the father's eyes in his mind. He cursed himself for dialing the patrol, for underestimating humans, for forgetting that their kind carried scars of worlds far harsher than this colony. He thought about leaving, about moving to another settlement, but even in his fear he knew he would never live down the shame of this night. Outside, the family slowly returned to their table, the children, whispering, asking their father if the patrol would come back. His deep voice reassured them, telling them no one would dare again. His wife placed a plate of food back into his hands, a quiet reminder that even in the shadow of fear, life continued, laughter could return, and though the music did not rise again, the air still carried the soft hum of resilience. The neighbors began to slip away, retreating to their homes, whispering stories they would retell 100 times, each one adding more weight to the father's presence. Some spoke of the badge, others of his eyes. Some swore the patrol saluted him not as chief, but as a commander of war, and soon the colony would know the tale, twisted and stretched, but always with the same ending. The father was untouchable, the alien neighbor had been humiliated, and the colony would never forget. The stars above glittered quietly, as if listening, as if recording the moment in their endless silence, and the father lifted his head toward them, his face unreadable, because only he knew the truth of his past, and only he knew how much longer he could balance the weight of 2 lives, the life of a family man and the life of a death worlder whose shadow stretched far beyond this small backyard. But for now, he let the night breathe, let his children smile again, and let the colony remember that power, once revealed, never truly goes back into hiding. The colony's quiet streets carried a strange tension the following evening, as if the very air remembered what had happened the night before. Neighbors who had once greeted the family with casual nods now looked at them with a mix of respect and unease, their voices softer, their steps slower when they passed the yard. The alien neighbor who had made the call did not come outside at all, his windows shut tight, his home dim, as though hiding would erase his shame. Yet whispers about him spread. In every corner of the settlement, children repeated the story in half-truths, some saying the man who lived beside the humans had been nearly arrested himself, others saying he had fainted when the chief showed his badge. The truth hardly mattered now. What mattered was the new lesson burned into everyone's mind. The father of that family was not only another colonist, he was the man who carried the law itself. And behind the badge lay something far older, far more dangerous. That night, as lanterns flickered again in the backyard, the family tried to return to normal, but normal no longer existed. The children played, though their laughter was softer, glancing often at the street, half expecting patrol ships to return. The mother tried to smile while arranging food, but her eyes betrayed her worry. She knew her husband had drawn a line the night before, and once a line is drawn in a colony, someone always tries to cross it. The father sat quietly at the head of the table, his expression calm but his gaze distant, as if he was listening to something far beyond the walls of the settlement. His badge rested on the table beside him, catching the glow of the lanterns, a small piece of metal that held the weight of authority and the echo of wars long past. When the children finally asked if the neighbor would call the patrol again, the father's voice came steady, telling them no, because men who live by jealousy only try once, and after they are reminded of who stands before them, they retreat. The children nodded, comforted, but the eldest child noticed the way his father's hand lingered on the badge, not like a symbol, but like a weapon, a reminder of battles he never spoke of. Across the settlement, other neighbors spoke in secret. Some aliens complained that humans were too bold, too loud, too fearless. Others whispered that it was better this way. That fear of one human could hold the colony together better than all the rules written on paper, and though they did not say it aloud, many of them slept uneasy, for the story of Earth had always been painted with shadow, the death world where life itself fought every breath, where survival meant turning soft hearts into steel, and now one of those very people lived among them, not just a man but a chief, not just a chief, but a veteran of wars that even the bravest aliens refused to name. The rumor grew faster than fire, spreading from homes to taverns, from workers to traders, until even those who had not seen the night with their own eyes believed they had. And in every telling, the father became taller, his eyes sharper, his silence heavier, his past darker, and the alien neighbor became smaller, weaker, almost pitiful. The story had taken on a life of its own, shaping the colony's memory before the father had spoken another word. Back in the backyard, the family ate in peace, the soft hum of insects filling the night air. The youngest child leaned against his father's arm, and for a moment it seemed like they had reclaimed their joy. Yet even then, the father's eyes never left the dark. House next door, his instincts sharp, his mind always listening for movement, because he knew fear does not end with silence. It lingers, it festers, and sometimes it strikes again. But if it did, he was ready, not just as a father, not just as a chief, but as a death worlder whose patience was deep but not endless. The stars above burned bright, indifferent, and eternal, but down below the colony shifted forever. Because one man had answered a call not with noise, not with violence, but with presence, and now every being who lived there understood the same truth. The law wore a human face, and that face carried shadows they could never truly know. The colony settled into an uneasy rhythm over the next few days, yet the shadow of that night never left. Whispers followed the family everywhere they went, some in awe, some in fear, some in quiet envy. When the children walked to the market, others stepped aside for them, as if even their laughter carried the echo of their father's power. The mother noticed it too, the way eyes lingered, the way voices hushed when she entered a room. She tried to ignore it, tried to smile politely, but deep inside she knew the Colony no longer saw them as just neighbors. They saw them as the family of the chief, and that title was heavier than it looked. In the backyard, the lanterns glowed once again, though the music was softer now. The family still gathered, still tried to hold on to their joy, because happiness is rebellion against fear. But across the street, behind the dark shutters of his home, the alien neighbor could not sleep. His mind replayed the night like a cruel loop. The badge shining in his eyes, the silence pressing down on his chest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the chief's calm stare, a stare that said more than punishment. It said he was nothing. The shame burned deeper than any wound, and shame in an alien heart often turns into something darker. He muttered to himself that humans had no right to rule, that they should not command fear, that their death-world ways did not belong here. Yet even as he whispered it, his hands shook, because deep inside he knew it was too late. The colony had already accepted the human's authority. The colony night was alive with light and sound, small lanterns glowing in the backyard and music rising into the sky, children's laughter mixing with the rhythm as they chased each other around tables filled with food, the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread drifting far across the quiet neighborhood. The family was happy, their voices carrying like warmth in the cold air of the alien world. But not everyone enjoyed the sound. From the dark window of a nearby house, an alien neighbor stood watching, his eyes narrowing with each burst of laughter, his scaled hands tapping against the glass with irritation. To him, joy was noise, happiness was disturbance, and neighbors should be silent unless spoken to. He had complained before, but tonight he wanted more than silence. He wanted to remind them who really controlled the street, so he lifted his communicator, his voice sharp and heavy as he called the colony authorities, reporting a disturbance, exaggerating the noise, adding lies of reckless behavior. His words dripping with annoyance. As he ended the call, a thin smile stretched across his face. In his mind, the law was on his side, and he imagined the music. Cut short, the laughter gone, the family embarrassed in front of everyone. He waited near his window, excitement building at the thought of flashing lights and loud orders. The party continued in bliss, the family unaware of the complaint. The father poured drinks for his guests, the mother lit another row of lanterns, and the children sang along to the old earth songs they barely knew. The air vibrated with harmony, as if even the stars above were listening. The alien neighbor stepped outside now, standing tall, already rehearsing the smug words he would speak when the patrol arrived. He thought about how they would thank him for keeping order, how the family would look down in shame, and how the celebration would end with tears instead of smiles. Minutes passed, and the first hum of engines reached his ears. His scaled lips curled upward in satisfaction. The sound grew louder. The ground trembled slightly as two patrol crafts descended, their searchlights sweeping across rooftops and gardens. Neighbors peeked out of windows, curious about the scene. Some whispered, others pulled their children closer. The family's music stopped as they looked up. Confusion in their eyes, the father stepped forward, calm but alert. The mother placed her hand on her youngest child's shoulder. The older children leaned against the table, their eyes wide. The neighbor folded his arms, confident that order would soon be restored. The patrol crafts landed with a hiss of steam, armored officers stepping out, their visors shining under the lantern light. The crowd around the street grew tense, whispers spreading quickly. The alien neighbor strutted forward, his voice loud, telling the officers he had filed the complaint, telling them the family was disturbing the peace. Pointing toward the backyard as if presenting criminals, his words oozed with certainty, expecting the officers to act without question. But the patrol did not move right away. They stood waiting as if for something else, their heads slightly tilted as if listening for a command. The alien neighbor frowned, confused by their hesitation. He raised his voice, demanding they act, demanding they silence the humans. But before he could speak another word, heavy footsteps echoed from the shadows at the edge of the yard. the sound of boots striking the stone path, steady and powerful, each step louder than the music that had stopped. The family turned their heads toward the sound. The children's eyes lit up, and the mother's lips curved into a smile of relief. The alien neighbor froze, his smugness slipping as a tall figure stepped into the light, wearing dark armor with a badge that glimmered in the glow of the lanterns. The officers straightened instantly, their hands snapping into a salute, and the crowd gasped as recognition spread. The father of the family walked forward, his presence heavy, calm yet commanding, the badge on his chest catching every glint of light. The alien neighbor's throat went dry as the truth revealed itself. He had not just called the authorities on a noisy family, he had summoned them to the home of the colony's new chief of security, the man who had the power to command fleets, the man whose voice could silence armies. The father glanced once at his children, once at his wife, then finally at the trembling neighbor. His silence was sharper than words, and the air seemed to grow colder as everyone realized that the neighbor's petty complaint had awakened something far greater. The alien neighbor tried to swallow, but his mouth was dry, his earlier confidence gone, because the one he had tried to shame was not an ordinary man, but the very authority he thought would punish them. The party had stopped, but the story had only begun, and every eye in the colony street watched in silence, knowing they would never forget the night when laughter called the law, and the law arrived wearing the father's badge. The street remained silent as the patrol crafts hummed softly in the background, their lights cutting across the yard and casting long shadows against the houses. Neighbors gathered at their windows and doorways, holding their breath as if they had stumbled into a scene too delicate to disturb. The alien neighbor who had made the call shifted uneasily now, his tail twitching against the ground. His voice that had been loud moments ago was caught in his throat. He wanted to step forward again to explain himself, but the badge on the father's chest gleamed with a power that crushed every excuse before it was spoken. The father stood tall, his face calm yet unreadable. His silence weighed heavier than 1,000 accusations. He looked first at the patrol, officers who lowered their visors respectfully, awaiting his signal, then at his family, whose worried faces softened the moment his eyes met theirs. His youngest child clutched his leg tightly, and he placed a steady hand on the boy's head, the simple gesture stronger than any promise. The alien neighbor finally cleared his throat, trying to summon the boldness he had felt earlier. He stammered that the music was too loud, that the family had disturbed the peace, that the rules of the colony should apply equally. But his words shook, and each one sounded smaller than the last. No one moved, no one spoke, because the patrol would not act until the chief gave his order. The father slowly stepped closer, his boots clicking against the stone path, every step making the alien neighbor shrink back further. When he spoke at last, his voice was deep and controlled, like thunder muffled behind mountains. He asked if laughter was now a crime, if family joy was now a disturbance. The question hung in the air like a blade. The alien neighbor tried to protest, claiming fairness, but the chief raised his hand, and the words died instantly. His eyes glinted in the lantern light, sharp and unblinking, the same eyes that had once stared down enemy warships across the void. The patrol officers exchanged quick glances, some of them whispering quietly, because they knew his past. They had heard the stories of battles fought far beyond this colony, where human fleets tore through enemy lines with a ruthlessness only Deathworlders could carry. They remembered that this man had commanded soldiers who never surrendered. They knew his silence was not weakness, but a storm waiting to break. The alien neighbor realized too late what kind of man he had provoked. The family remained silent, watching their father, trusting his presence more than words. The chief leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice so only those nearest could hear. But the weight of his words carried across the entire crowd. He warned the neighbor that humans had not crossed light years to be silenced by jealousy, that unity was the law, not pettiness, that every false complaint was not just noise, but poison against the colony's peace. The alien neighbor's scales quivered as sweat beaded along his brow, his pride breaking under the pressure. The patrol officers nodded firmly, recording his words as if they were law. And in truth, they were. For in this colony, his badge was the final authority. The neighbor stumbled back a step, muttering apologies, his earlier arrogance crumbling into dust. The chief turned away without, raising his voice further, and yet the silence that followed was louder than any punishment could have been. He walked back to his family, lifting his youngest child into his arms, nodding once at the officers who immediately saluted before stepping back toward their ships. The crafts rose into the night sky, leaving the colony in heavy quiet. Once more, the neighbors who had been watching whispered among themselves, their awe mixing with fear, for they had all seen how quickly the mood had shifted, how a simple celebration had turned into a reminder of the power hidden beneath human calm. The alien neighbor retreated into his home, shutting the door quickly, his pride gone, and though no one would speak it aloud, every person who had witnessed the moment understood the same truth, that the father's authority did not come only from the badge on his chest, but from the fire of his past, the fire of a death-worlder who did not need to shout to be obeyed. And as the family returned to their gathering, quieter now but still together, everyone watching knew that no one in that colony would ever dare to call the law against them again.